much easier to break it down. So this technique was first developed, as I said, for amyloid in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. And it worked so well that it was moved into clinical trials for humans very quickly. Actually, it was moved too quickly, and the first clinical trial had to be abandoned because they got it wrong. But they understood very rapidly what they had got wrong, and they started a new trial. And the procedure now is in phase 3 of clinical trial. So that means the last phase before regulatory approval. That's really good news. But there are other amyloids. We have not needed to put any money into the development of this immune therapy against Alzheimer's amyloid because lots of other people are putting money into that. But there are other types of amyloid that accumulate in aging, and nobody else has been supporting immunotherapy for that. And now is the time to do that. So we are now supporting one person in Houston and another person in Dublin to work on exactly that. The type of amyloid that we are getting rid of here is something called transthyretin amyloid. And it accumulates in the heart and also in other tissues, but it is especially abundant, especially serious in very, very old people. Some of you will have heard of an organization called the Supercentenarian Research Foundation. Supercentenarians are people who have reached the age of 110, and not many people do that. There are only about 70 people in the world that have been verified to be 110 or more. Lately, people have been arranging to do autopsies on people who reach the age of 110, after they die, of course. And it turns out that most people who die that old have got amyloid in the heart. And it seems to be the thing that killed them. They have so much amyloid that it has caused them to have heart failure. So if we fix all the other things that most people die of at age 80 or 90, we already know that this is going to be a really big problem. And it's about time we started to make some progress against it. So we are very pleased to be able to start funding this project. Another project that we are funding now, just started doing it, is something that I have had on my list for several years, but we never had enough money. But now we are funding a PhD student, a very talented guy who has worked with us for a long time, to do this work. This is happening at one of the biggest and most famous research centers in the world working on aging, the Buck Institute. Many of you will probably have heard of the Buck Institute. It is in California, just north of San Francisco. And the laboratory that we are funding is the laboratory of Judy Campisi, who is one of the most smart and respected and generally valuable people working on the biology of aging. She studies cells that accumulate in the body that are senescent. In other words, they are in a state which is similar to the state that cells get into when you make them divide a lot in the laboratory. Many of you will have heard of the Hayflick limit, the finite number of divisions that a cell can perform before it stops dividing. When cells reach that Hayflick limit, they look different than they used to. They express different genes, different proteins. And occasionally, cells like that appear in the human body. Probably they appear because of chromosome breakage rather than because of division. But the fact is, they look very like these senescent cells. And Judy Campisi and other people have realized that these cells are probably bad for us. They are probably toxic because it seems that they secrete toxic proteins. They make proteins that we don't want, and they export them into the extracellular space. So we would like to get rid of these cells. And Judy has had some ideas about how to do that for a long time, but she has never been able to find support to actually pursue that project. So now we are supporting that project in Judy's lab. So I'm very pleased about that. I should probably talk some more about the other changes that have happened in the Sense Foundation. I mentioned that Sense Foundation is completely separate from the Methuselah Foundation. We have no overlap of personnel. So in particular, that means that the management of Sense Foundation is completely different. The CEO of Sense Foundation is a guy named Michael Cope, and probably most of you have not heard of Mike, because he has only been involved in this area since we started the foundation. His history is very valuable for this work. He spent more than 10 years working for the University of Michigan, a big university in America, as a lawyer working on technology transfer. So in other words, the use of research that has happened in a university by companies that are working in the private sector. Then, after that, he spent 10 more years working in biotechnology startups in California. So he has seen the business side of biotechnology from both sides, and that is exactly what you need in a chief operating officer, a chief executive officer of a visionary non-profit working in biotechnology, which is, of course, exactly what we are. So he was the main person responsible for persuading Peter Thiel to give us a large amount of money this year. I probably couldn't have done it myself. The other person that we have brought in on the management side, the main person, is Sarah Ma. She also has a very remarkable history. She has 2 undergraduate degrees, one in law and one in theoretical physics. She also had a master's degree in social anthropology. Then, for good measure, she has a PhD in theoretical physics. She also worked for a major management consultancy firm, Accenture, for 7 years. And then she was the chief operating officer of a think tank called Demos, a political organisation in England, before she joined us. So she has a lot of talents, and she and Mike Cope are working together on the management of Sense Foundation, and they are making a very great deal of difference to our credibility. For a long time, in fact, since the beginning of the Methuselah Foundation, we have been trying to improve our ability to get people to give us money to do this work. And of course, we are interested in getting money from wealthy people, but also from large numbers of less wealthy people. It has been very difficult to get money from large numbers of less wealthy people. There are just not enough people like you in the world, people who understand the value of defeating aging, people who are willing to study how we are going about it, how sense is supposed to work, well enough to realize that it's a realistic approach. So most of our funding has come from a small number of wealthy individuals who have been visionary enough to understand this. I already mentioned Peter Thiel. Also, our number 2 donor is a guy named Bill Liao, who is another wealthy individual from the IT world. He has started 7 different companies that he has taken to the stock market, to IPO. One of them was Zing.com. Many of you will have heard of Zing. It is the European equivalent of LinkedIn. So he is very successful in business, and he is our number 2 donor. So we are interested in increasing attractiveness to people like that. There are many people who have given us extensive verbal support. They say to me, yes, that they think that my mission is really important, and they think that sense is a viable approach. But somehow they don't give it any money. And I think that the management of Sense Foundation is a really big part of why we can change that now, how we can change that. Because if you are thinking of giving an organization a lot of money, then there are three things that you have to be convinced of. You have to be convinced that they are doing important work. You have to be convinced that the plan that they have for achieving their goals is a realistic plan. But you also have to be convinced that they are a capable organization, that they will be able to implement that plan rather than just wasting the money trying unsuccessfully to implement the plan. And I think that now we have an organization, including business skills, that is giving much more confidence that we really have got the ability to execute the Sense plan. One other feature of the organization which helps me to really know that that is true is that the two top donors, Peter Thiel and Bill Liao, have both joined our board of directors. Peter did not join it himself. He asked two of his staff, the people who run his philanthropic organization, his foundation, he asked them to join our board of directors. Bill Liao joined it himself. So now we have a real vote of confidence in the long term that we are an organization we can deliver. And I think that that is a massive step forward. So I am very optimistic that we will really achieve something. There's one last thing that I wanted to mention, and it again relates to the research center. And the big reason I wanted to mention it is because it shows how important it is and how valuable it is that organizations like this exist, which bring together people interested in different aspects of futurist technology, whether it's life extension or uploading or cryonics or artificial intelligence or whatever. What I wanted to mention is that we have brought in another person on the management side, a research operations manager, and the person we brought in is someone whose name you probably all know. Her name is Tanya Jones. She used to run Alcor. She was CEO of Alcor for a little while, and before that she worked for Alcor for a long time. She has done more cryopreservations than anybody else in the world, and she's absolutely brilliant. And I've known her a long time. I have been hoping to bring her on board in my organization for many years, and now it's happened. She's working with Sense Foundation. And she's certainly making a big difference to the efficiency of the research center and also to the operation of the whole research activity of Sense Foundation. She is able to improve communication within the organization. Her role involves doing all the tedious but really important troubleshooting that is involved in getting any organization with people in it to work smoothly. So I'm really delighted to have her on board. So I think I will stop there so that there is maybe 10 minutes for people to ask questions about what's going on, either about the science of sense or about the organization or indeed anything else that you'd like to know. Okay.
Is LifeStar's yours? LifeStar Friday?
Okay, so sure, yeah. So the question is LifeStar an organization that I'm involved in, or what is it? Okay. So LifeStar was started a couple of years ago with a small amount of money from another person who has given, another wealthy person from the IT world who has also given my organization a little bit of money. His name is William Millard. He was important in the computing world a long time ago, 30 years ago. One of the things he did was he founded Computer Land, which was a computer retail company in the US and elsewhere. And his daughter, Barbara Logan, is now the CEO of a foundation called the Lifestar Institute. The other major person in Lifestar, Kevin Parrott, is actually someone I've already mentioned, though I didn't mention his name. He is also the PhD student that we are funding in Judy Campese's lab. But Kevin is actually in his 40s. He ran his own company for 20 years, and that was before he came back to work in biology. So yes, they are the Lifestar Institute. They have been mainly focusing not on funding research directly, but on improving communication and promoting collaborations between organizations that have an interest in life extension. And they did a very important thing last year. They ran a workshop that brought together some very prestigious gerontologists to discuss the possibility of interventions against aging that can be begun late in life. So all of you are probably aware that that's the big attraction of sense, that it doesn't have to be started when you are just a young adult or even younger than that. Sense is a way of regenerating people, of actually turning back the biological clock. So taking people who are already in middle age or even older and really making them into young adults again. And the Lifestar Institute ran a workshop which was not about sense itself, but just about the general idea of trying to develop therapies like that, therapies that really work, even if you start them late in life. Much of what we discussed was to do with the economic advantages of therapies like that, and in particular the ability of such therapies to affect the baby boom generation, the generation which is in danger of bankrupting the social security system in the USA, because they realize that that is the best way to get politicians to listen to you if you talk about money. So this workshop gave rise to an article, a journal article, which came out just about 2 or 3 months ago in a journal called Science Translational Medicine. That's a journal published by Science Magazine, published by the AAAS. And it has already had quite a bit of attention. But over the next few months, we are going to ensure that it gets even more attention. We are going to make sure that lots of politicians, especially in America, see this article and understand how authoritative it is, because many of the authors are extremely well-respected gerontologists. So we are quite hopeful that this can be important. So to answer your question directly, Lifestar is not a part of Sense Foundation. It's not even officially affiliated with Sense Foundation, but we work very closely with them. And actually, Barbara and Kevin are also both members of Sense Foundation's board of directors. So yes, we are very closely linked. Martin.
Aubrey, first, thanks so much for everything that you've been doing for so long. Lots of other people. Thank you.
Thank you.
One criticism that I get hit with a lot, and I wonder if you hear it and what your response would be. It's sort of what I would call a singularity criticism. That, well, according to Ray Kurzweil, we're only 20 years or so, plus or minus, from a point in time when knowledge will be exponentially so rapidly that whatever we can accomplish over the next 20 years will be, I don't know, one, but 50, 1 and a half. 20 years from now, What's the sense of really spinning our wheels now? Why don't we just wait for this date that Kurzweil assures us will absolutely positively come, that the singularity gets there, includes families and wars and everything?
Okay, so Martine's question is, how would I answer the challenge to my work that says that, what's the point? We're going to have a singularity in 20 years, according to Ray Kurzweil. Technology that is far smarter than us will exist, and super intelligence will be able to solve the problem of aging one way or another far more quickly than we could solve it. So why don't we just enjoy ourselves for the next 20 years and just wait for that to happen? And actually, to answer your question, do I get that criticism, that challenge very much? No, I actually hardly get it at all, which does surprise me. I would have expected to get it more, but I don't really get it. However, since I've got it now, let me give you my answer to it. My answer is, well, that might happen, but then it might not. At the moment, when I read and I talk to Ray about his reasons for predicting particular events, particular timeframes for particular amounts of progress, I'm struck by the fact that he understands that some of his predictions are much more confident than others. In particular, the predictions about which he is most confident are the ones where he can be precise about the informational complexity of what he is predicting. So let's take developing computers that can play chess better than any human can play. I can't remember how long ago, but certainly more than a decade in advance of that event, he predicted it to within a year. And that's the sort of thing that his methods are really good at predicting. But he completely acknowledges that there are other things he is predicting for which he is much less able to quantify the informational complexity. And certainly the creation of more than human intelligence is exactly such a thing. Because he can look at simple parts of the brain, like the olfactory bulb or the hippocampus, about which we understand already quite a lot, and he can say reasonably confidently how complicated they are and how they work and what they do. But in order to go from there to talk about the cortex, to talk about the seat of higher thought, he really has to make some very big guesses about how it will work. And those guesses could be wrong by a large number of orders of magnitude. And he knows this. So, if you ask him in detail how confident he is that that will be achieved, it's hard to say. Furthermore, if we think about the singularity in the way that most people define it, in other words, the creation of really good, recursively self-improving artificial intelligence that understands itself well enough to be able to rewrite itself and improve itself, then at this point we don't even know whether that is conceptually possible. Some people have pointed out that if it is possible, then it may happen a lot sooner than the creation of better than human intelligence, because in theory you could have seed AI that had this recursively self-improving capability, but which started off much less capable than a human being is. However, at the moment, we don't know whether that's possible at all. I mean, I've written self-modifying code. Maybe there are other people here who've done it too. But the point is that the self-modifying part is a very tiny component of the overall program. And it's still very possible that there is some intrinsic, unknown, but nevertheless intrinsic, unbreakable barrier to the writing of self-modified code. It may be that the thing that a program can write is in some very profound way always going to be much simpler than the program that writes it. We don't know any such rule, something like the halting problem. We don't know any such rule, but it may be that such a rule exists, and that recursively self-improving is actually theoretically impossible. Okay. I don't want to rely on it being possible. And so many of you will probably know that Martine works on a completely different approach to immortality, to defeating aging, namely the creation of mind files. I don't need to talk about it because Martine is going to talk about it herself. But I'm very pleased that that is happening too, because the work that I'm doing may not happen as quickly as I hope it will. I think that it's really important that we have people working on all the alternative ways to create the defeat of aging, because we just don't know which one is going to come along soonest. So I have some sympathy for the singularity objection, but it's not nearly strong enough to stop me from working on the brute force biological approach to combating it.
Good.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, hello. Okay, so the question for Tudor is, does the work on senescent cells that we're now funding at the Buck Institute have any connection with the work on telomerase and telomerase? And the answer is probably not, because in the human body, there are only a few types of cells which divide often enough to need to express any telomerase in order to avoid reaching their Hayward limit. Basically, these are the stem cells of the small number of rapidly renewing tissues: the blood, the inside of the gut, the outside of the skin, probably the lung. That's probably it. And the stem cells of those tissues already actually express a small amount of telomerase. Those stem cells seem to be able to go on for a normal lifetime as it is. Cells that look like fibroblasts in the lower layer of the skin, which are the cells normally used to demonstrate the Hayflick limit and to study replicative senescence, those cells don't normally need to divide that often. When you put them in a culture dish and you ask them to divide and you are not really treating them the way they are in the body. You are essentially tricking them into thinking that they are an infinitized wound that they can never quite close. Okay, so when we see cells of this sort in the human body, probably they almost always got that way, not by dividing a lot, but by suffering a lot of chromosomal damage, especially breakage. When a chromosome breaks in two, the ends of the chromosome that have been created that way, they just look like the ends of DNA, except that they don't have the telomere sequence. So they look like the ends of a chromosome that has undergone a division. And sure enough, a lot of the same things happen in the cell for that reason. Actually, you need more than one such event. You need quite a few of them in order to make a human cell unhappy. Human cells are very good at repairing the chromosome break. Otherwise, we would have a lot of senescent cells very early in life. But sometimes they get overwhelmed by the amount of damage, and we think that that is how these cells appear in the body. So there are reasons why we need to manipulate telomeres and telomerase in the human body in order to defeat aging, but they are not the elimination of these cells. Actually, what we need to do is to eliminate cells which have successfully turned on the telomerase protein, telomerase gene, and which have therefore become able to create indefinite cell division. And of course, indefinite cell division is cancer. My proposed approach to fixing that problem involved actually getting rid of telomerase and therefore exacerbating the problem of senescence. We would certainly have a lot of cells which would reach genuine replicative senescence because they would be the stem cells of these rapidly renewing tissues. And I have proposed that that's okay because we can do periodic stem cell therapies to replace stem cells in those tissues. Okay, at the back? I can hear you.
All right. One more, excuse me. This is going to be the last question because we are supposed to move on with the project.
Okay.
Let's start this way. My social problem. If I were a billionaire, surely I'm not. If I were, I'm sure my money to because doesn't need it. By the way, or to singular entirely, for one simple reason. I mean, there's no doubt that an anti-aging therapy is a good thing, while we still don't know if the superintelligence would be benevolent or malevolent. There is also this problem, but there is no doubt it would be a good thing. So my question is, anyway, do you think that if you find a solution, this will be available to most people, middle class, proletarians, or and why? Because it's cheap, or because you think the government would think that this is a smart thing to do? So that's my question. Look at the social aspect.
Right. So first of all, to address your comment at the beginning of what you said, yes, you have reminded me of another reason why it is important to support the straightforward biotechnological approach to combating aging. The reason is that if we succeed in that approach, if we solve aging decisively using biotechnology, we will have removed one of the reasons to create superintelligence. And that could be a good thing, because there is certainly a big risk that if we create superintelligence, we will do it wrongly and create superintelligence that just wipes us out, which would be a bit of a pity. I'm quite keen on removing reasons to develop that thing in the first place, so that maybe we can just get on with our lives the way we already know them. So your question is about the availability of these technologies once they are developed. And yes, many people ask this. Many people are worried that if we create technologies to defeat aging, they will only be available to wealthy people because they will cost a lot of money. And this will increase the social divide between the rich and the poor. And I think this is a very legitimate concern. But I am not concerned about it at all, because there is a very good economic argument that says it will not happen. Essentially, yes, I think that governments will provide these therapies to everybody who needs enough to need them, even if they have no money to pay for them. And the reason they will do that is not just because of humanitarian reasons, but simply because it's extraordinarily expensive not to have these therapies. Extraordinarily expensive to give therapies to keep people alive for a little while in a frail, diseased, decrepit state. Of course, also there is the indirect costs. The loved ones of elderly people are less productive because they have to spend time looking after their elderly relatives. And there are many other reasons why it's extraordinarily expensive not to give people these therapies. So it will be economically suicidal for any country to restrict the availability of these therapies to people who can pay for them. If we would want to look at today's world for some sort of precedent, then existing high-tech, expensive medicine is not a good precedent at all, because with that medicine, for the most common diseases, of course, the most common diseases are the diseases of aging, and the medicines that we have don't work very well yet. So the economic arithmetic doesn't work out. People have to spend money on therapies to prevent these diseases, but they only prevent them for a short while, and have to spend the other money anyway to keep people alive in a bad state. If we can have preventative medicine that stops people from getting into the bad state, it's completely different. So there is a good precedent in today's world, but it's not today's high-tech medicine. The best precedent is basic education. Even in countries that really don't like taxing, countries like the USA, for example, there is universal, free basic education. And the reason there is because if a country does not educate its children, then 20 years later it will be economically crippled because there will be no skills. So I think it will be exactly like that. And these therapies will be available to everybody almost immediately after they become available to anyone.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. Now let's move on with the talk. Well, in session of yesterday, we said many times that we are not first the transhumanist history. An Italian futurist of the last century were really transhumanists. But of course, when we think of modern transhumanism, there is one person who started it all in the 80s and 90s. And this person is Max Moore, who is the next speaker. Let me just set his PowerPoint. This one. And I give the floor to Max. Forward button. Down forward button.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank Giulio for inviting me and for organizing this. I've organized a few conferences myself. I know how much work they can be and how stressful. So I appreciate that very much, especially the chance to meet some of you who I've only seen online before and haven't seen in the flesh. It's always a pleasure and sometimes a surprise to match physical faces with names. Now the title of my talk is The Expanded Self, the Past, Present and Future of Being You. And it probably isn't necessary here in Milan, where everybody's slim and attractive, but I should just make clear that the expanded self I'm talking about is not the kind we see in most places of people expanding physically. Instead, I'm talking about more kind of a psychological, existential expansion. Now, one thing about transhumanism that distinguishes it from other versions of what we might just broadly call futurism is that I think transhumanists appreciate much more that the future is not going to be like Star Trek, to take kind of the classic model. In Star Trek, we have pretty advanced technologies. We've got machines that can synthesize things instantly. We have interstellar space drives. We even have the transporter beam, which is a very advanced technology. And yet the people in the 23rd and 24th century seem to be remarkably familiar. A little bit nice in general, but they're very recognizable. They seem to be completely human. They have the same drives, the same ways of thinking, the same memory capacity, the same intelligence. And the medicine, frankly, is just lousy. Look at McCoy when someone killed somebody, he's dead, Jim, doesn't even do CPR, not anything else. So their medicine is pretty bad. Now, I think as transhumanists, we recognize that's a rather silly view of the future. The future is not just going to be faster, more into space with ray guns and transporter beams. It's going to be something where human beings themselves are transformed. That's the essence of transhumanism, after all, going beyond the human condition. So that's really going to be my focus a little bit here, as to what is this person, what is the self, what is the individual who we're hoping to extend their lives out and expand in various ways. And I particularly want to look at that from the point of view of some doubts that people have had throughout history and that have been renewed recently of this idea that perhaps the self doesn't really even exist, perhaps it's a bit of a fiction. And my perspective on that would be that I kind of agree with that. It kind of depends on how you want to define the self and what you want it to be. But to some extent, I think that's true, that we don't really exist. We're kind of a collection of different stuff that shuffles around loosely together, but we're not very unified or integrated. And I think post-humans, whatever exactly they will be much more true individuals, true selves, even though they'll be in some ways distributed, complex, radically different from what we understand as individuals today. Nevertheless, I think they will in some sense be more unified, more real as individuals than we are today. Just as many of you may be familiar with the concept of philosophical zombies, philosophers' idea that there could be people walking around who look and act and move, behave, and speak just like you and I, but internally they have no mental states, no intentionality, as Searle would say. And of course, some people think that that's how artificial intelligence might be too. Skeptics about machine consciousness think they could be intelligent without being conscious. Well, in some sense, there are people who are saying that is our situation. I mean, we don't recognize it. And that may seem to be impossible and paradoxical. That's what I want to focus on. So perhaps we're not really conscious in any very interesting sense yet, and we're not really quite individuals yet. Now, there's a couple of quotes, people who've kind of suggested themes that I think relate very well here. One of these, I think I got this a couple of days ago from Wildcat, also known as Tiger. I think this is from your essay. I haven't seen this one by Thomas Sutts. He put it very nicely. He said, people often say that this or that person has not yet found himself. But the self is not something that one finds, it's something that one creates. And of course, the other person who said a lot, and I'm very fond of quoting, is Nietzsche, said a lot to say about these kinds of things. I'll give you a couple of quotes. First one from The Gay Science, who says, we, however, want to be those who we are. You, the unique, the incomparable, those who give themselves their own law, those who create themselves. He also said, will us. Active, successful natures act not according to the dictum, know thyself, but as if before them the commandment, will a self, and thou shalt become a self. And that's really going to be my theme, that we haven't quite become selves yet, but we're on the way. Okay, so I'm not really going to try and give a strict philosopher's definition of ego versus individual versus person, but these are all slightly different concepts. But really what I'm talking about is, who is this person? What is this that thinks, feels, acts, has plans, often acts with himself of what they have to do, has problems with priorities, has conflicting drives and urges? What is this individual self that we're talking about spending the life of and living into the future? Well, quick little potted history of the self. This is an enormous topic. There are some very good books on this. This is a book by Charles Taylor, Sources of Self, which is well worth reading. The whole concept of modern self is interesting because it has changed a lot over history. You can go back and look at the views of Buddha, who in some ways had a kind of a no-self view, that the self doesn't really exist, and more recently in the work of Derek Parfit, who's taken a fairly similar view to that, and more recently the complex syndrome, a bit about. And then we had the idea of the enlightened self, which was to be something very solid. Here's the self, very recognizable. We can talk about the self, and the self has rights, and rights based on selfhood, and self being distinct from the environment, and the distinction between the selves. But the whole kind of Western thought dominated by Christianity, there was a soul. And whenever you talk about a soul, you get this clear connotation that there is a thing. It's always a thing. You go the way if you had the right kind of a thing. Apparatus. In fact, there's some spiritualists in the late 19th century thought you could weigh a soul. Weigh a body before and after death at a slightly different weight, supposedly, and that's the weight of the soul. So it's definitely a thing. It's not something abstract. Speaking. Now to Descartes, René Descartes, who always starts off modern philosophy classes. There's only philosophers call that modern, going back several hundred years. But modern philosophy starts with Descartes, and he thought one thing he could be absolutely certain of, even if he tried to doubt everything, and he applied his method of doubt to try and get rid of all uncertain knowledge, one thing he could not doubt was that he must exist. Why? Because he's thinking. So long as he's thinking, he must exist. I think, therefore I am. Because what if I think, well, what if I don't exist? Well, that requires that I exist to doubt that I exist, so I must exist. However, of course, he thought he was being very, very conservative. That was an absolutely certain conclusion. But as I think it was Bertrand Russell who pointed out, really all he's entitled to say is, there are thoughts. What is this I who's doing the thinking? He hadn't really proved that to exist. And come back to Hume in a minute, because people always challenge that idea. Kant also was very much an enlightenment kind of thinker on those lines. He distinguished between the phenomenal and the self. Now, the phenomenal self is the one that we're kind of aware of and think about, and that self is changeable. But to him, I think it's very much the Platonist in him. The noumenal self was the underlying real self who we can never actually access directly, and that one is unchanging. So they all had rather similar views of the self as being this very distinct, unified thing. So is there a self? Jean Baudrillard quote there, Americans have no identity, but do have wonderful teeth. More broadly, do any of us have a real identity? Are we real individuals? No self-views, as they go back to Buddha. David Hume, I think, puts it, not many people read Buddha in the original, but David Hume, of course, is popular in philosophy classes. And to Hume, the self also didn't seem to be real, it seemed to exist. He thought it was more like a commonwealth of these elements that were somewhat related in various ways, and that's what we call the self. Composed of a lot of different elements that are constantly changing, but there's something about them that leads us to call it a self. Now, I think Hume's argument is problematic because his epistemology is problematic. He doesn't believe that any idea is legitimate unless you can trace it back to a simple idea, or a source, an impression from the senses, essentially. And when he looked inside himself, he asked himself, where is the self? He said, in the Treatise of Human Nature, he said, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. So he looks inside himself and says, look, I feel heat and cold, and this thought and that impulse, but where's the self? I don't see it anywhere. So he concluded that it's really kind of an illusion. I think, again, the epistemology that's perhaps mistaken. Maybe a self doesn't have to be something you can have a sense impression of. But later on, more recently, philosopher Daniel Dennett has taken a similar kind of view, a rather deflationary account of the self. According to Dennett, selves are not something that are physically detectable. It's very much in line with Hume, even though he has a more sophisticated epistemology, a bit more liberal. Instead, he thinks they're kind of convenient fictions. They're things we make up in order to make sense of the world. Who's making sense of the world? Well, that's kind of a paradoxical question. Nobody's making sense of the world. The system is trying to make sense of itself and the world. And so, to make sense of the world, what we do is we tell stories. We like to analyze things as philosophers, but essentially fiction is very important. We make up stories, and we're a very important character in our own stories. So, really, the self is a fictional character. It's crucial to our narrative. Yeah, so more think along these lines. Most of you will be familiar with these two fellows. As Marvin Minsky has been associated with transhumanism, many people will be familiar with his work on the society of mind, where again he very explicitly takes a view of the self, the mind in particular, as being a collection of different agents that work together. Different agents have evolved to perform different functions, and they've learned to cooperate in various ways and to provide what seems to be some kind of individual. But in fact, this idea that there is a single agent, a single mind, unified entity, he thinks has become a grave impediment, as he puts it, to the progress of psychology, understanding how we think and believe. As he says, the legend of a single self can only hurt us from the target of the inquiry, psychological sciences. And similarly, Michael Gazzaniga in The Social Brain, suggesting that our mental lives amount to a reconstruction of the independent activities of the many brain systems we all possess. It's very similar to Marvin's view, just from a different discipline. So he sees what we have as having a federation of states, a social brain. So to further reinforce this point about, we think with these very unified selves, so it still tends to be the intuitive view. It's kind of hard to shape the view with these individuals. But we can see from neuropsychology and related fields that it doesn't take much to pull back the curtain to reveal this illusion. There are all kinds of conditions in which suddenly the simple unified self that Descartes believed in is no longer so obvious. There's a lot of material here, so I'm just going to be selective here, but most of you read about know about multiple personalities, a fascinating phenomenon where you can actually have coherent functioning personas who sometimes don't even know about each other, sometimes they do, and they have various levels of dominance. And it's very odd how that works, and I don't think it's really well understood how that works in the brain. How can one brain support different personalities? There's a couple of interesting fictional future versions of controlled multiple personality, which I'd recommend. Two books in particular. One of my all-time favorite science fiction novels is Aristoi by Walter John Williams. Anybody hasn't read that one, where there are some superhuman characters who have an implanted device which allows them to deliberately fracture themselves into multiple personalities, each of which has different characteristics. And so, in a sense, you've got a society of minds, and they can advise the main personality, and they're all aware of one another. And that could be quite handy. We all kind of function like that in various degrees. In different situations, we may bring certain qualities to the surface, but there it's in a very controlled way where he really experiences them as separate personalities. I'm sure most of you are also familiar with split brain patients who, when the corpus callosum is severed within the center of the brain, they seem to develop two quite independent personalities. So again, if there's really a soul, which one gets the soul? How come both can be conscious and they can also get into conflict? One person's hand can disagree with what the other one is doing. Another interesting case is blindness denial. People who actually cannot see, there's damage to the optic nerve and there's just no way they can see, it could be quite physically certain of that, and yet something in their brains is telling them that they can see. They'll walk through a room and they'll fall over a chair, they'll fall over the chair, stumble, and you say, well, why did you walk into that chair if you can see? Well, somebody moved it when I wasn't paying attention. Or the lights are kind of dim in here. They'll make up the most amazing reasons to explain why they're walking into things and falling over. So they physically cannot see, but they don't believe that they're blind, which might seem impossible. How can you be blind and not be aware of being blind? And yet, that apparently is possible. Now, Descartes, I'm sure, would have said, well, that's nonsense. That must be being faked. It's impossible. If you can't see, you must be aware of not being able to see, because the mind is transparent. You have access to all of it, a unified being. But apparently not so much. So, yeah, blindness denial syndrome. Colors, but doesn't know they can see them, they can't distinguish between them. One of the well-known cases was from Oliver Sacks, many of you have read some of his books, one with the fantastic title, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. That's based on a kind of facial agnosia, or maybe more broad visual agnosia, but the title comes from a fellow who was going out for the day and went to pick up his wife's head, thinking it was his hat, because they had the same shape. So there's nothing wrong with his vision, he could see perfectly well, but somehow could not recognize what the object was. He could describe it abstractly, geometrically, he could say it's kind of semicircular with a bit sticking out here. So, oh, that must be my hat. Oh no, it's my wife's head, sorry. So it's a very peculiar thing. How can you see, have an undamaged optic nerve, be able to see perfectly well and not recognize spaces, or even objects? So a whole bunch of those. And rather like the blindness denial, there's also a condition called agnosoagnosia, which is basically inability to gain some feedback about your own condition, not realizing that you have one of these problems. So you can get people who are cortical deafness, that they don't perceive any auditory information, even though their hearing is perfectly intact. Facial agnosia I mentioned. Amusia, people who can hear music perfectly well, distinguish the scales and so on, but they don't know it's music. It doesn't mean anything to them. Another of my favorite cases, also from Oliver Sacks, is a case of neglect. A patient who woke up after some traffic accident or something, some damage to their head, and woke up and suddenly horrified to find that somebody's leg was in the bed with them. Well, actually, it was their own leg, but they experienced this as being someone else's leg, an alien object, not part of them at all. And they kind of panicked and threw the leg out of the bed and fell out of the bed with it. And lay on the floor, kind of puzzled, what the hell is going on here? Why did I fall out of bed? And then they managed to put themselves back into bed, dragging them with apparently one leg. And then suddenly he started screaming, oh my God, it's stuck to me! This leg is stuck to me, get it off! And that's a very strange case where someone cannot recognize their own leg as theirs. So that's kind of a more extreme, I guess, than the alien hand syndrome. There's another case of I guess that related to hemi-neglect, which, although that's specific to the leg, hemi-neglect is a strange brain disorder where people cannot process, again, they can see and see perfectly well all their senses working, but they can't recognize anything on one side of their visual field or visual awareness. And interestingly enough, the most famous experiment on this was done right outside the door here, the Duomo Square, where the psychologists took their patients, this is back in the 1970s, to the square and had them walk along and describe what they were seeing. And on one side, on the left side, they couldn't recognize anything. Nothing was there on the left side as far as they're concerned. In some people's cases, they can't see their left arm or their left leg, that half doesn't exist. So they walked along the square and nothing existed on the left. But then they came from the other angle, from the other opposite angle, and walked. And of course, that side was now on the other side, and they could see perfectly well, and they could describe things. Now they couldn't see on this new left side. So again, a very strange case where the senses are working, but somehow the brain is dividing that off, and they don't recognize what's going on one side. Another case I got from Thomas Metzinger, who wrote the ego tunnel. He talks about the rubber hand illusion, which I think has interesting implications for virtual reality and for prosthetics. This is a case where your arm is covered by a screen, and you have a fake arm over the top of it, both in the visual field, and then somebody tickles your arm underneath, under the screen, and you experience that as being a tickle on the artificial arm, even though there are no actual sensors there. And apparently that can be induced in just a couple of minutes. It's quite easy to do. Try that experiment sometime this weekend if you can get the right equipment. It just needs a screen and a feather, so let's try that out. It's good. So it has interesting implications for, it's kind of the opposite, I guess, of phantom limbs, where you're actually experiencing a limb that's not yours as yours. So all of these phenomena, I think, suggest that this idea of the unified self is very misleading. We are actually a bunch of different systems, collection of different brain functions that have evolved for various purposes, and usually they cooperate somewhat reasonably well, but sometimes that cooperation can disappear. Actually, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, this may just get more extreme in the future if we start thinking about the future of the self, future possible selves. Most of us, either from science fiction or just discussions of technological possibility, will recognize that there are even more possibilities for fractured cells, for complex cells, for perhaps people combining in various ways. If we imagine closer and closer neural connections, for instance, and we're already connected with other people all the time right now through Facebook and through Twitter and so on, but that's still a pretty crude interface. What if we have very direct connections to one another's thinking? Not necessarily permanently, but for certain purposes, like for teams or for people looking at relationship issues, for instance, you might want to get into really close contact. What does that do to the sense of self and individuality? Where do you end and someone else starts off? Perhaps there could be different levels of selves, which arguably already exist. If you think about when you're driving along, you may be completely unaware of your driving. You may suddenly realize, oh, I just drove 3 or 4 miles and have no awareness of doing that driving. So who was doing the driving there? Well, in some sense you were, but not the you that you think of as you, not the conscious you, not the one that's kind of thinking, critical and self-aware. That you was doing something else. Maybe in the future there will be different, or even higher levels of self, where there'll be a self who's doing the driving, there'll be the self who's thinking about some problem, and then there's some kind of meta self or super self who's thinking about, oh, look at my 2 other selves and what they're doing. How should I change myself today? I might be having a higher level conversation, and these things might be going on somewhat independently. And I think some people might have had this experience already, of, especially if you've taken psychedelic drugs. You might have had that experience of externalizing yourself, seeing yourself as a separate individual, be able to take a step back and rethink who you are. You can do that, of course, through meditation and just contemplation, but taking from me, psychedelic drugs can help with that sometimes. It enables you to really see yourself as a stranger in that sense. So in the future, there are all these possibilities. There are also exocells, again, really adding onto ourselves either permanently or temporarily, not necessarily in the cyborg sense, maybe more of a functional addition to the self. Such as Lenko used to talk about functional cyborgs or fiborgs, who aren't necessarily cyborgs you're familiar with, but is a result of the trend we're seeing of increasingly intimate connection between biology and technology, extending our functional abilities. At what point do we consider an added function that may not be physically attached? When is that part of us, and when is it not? I mean, my watch I never take off because kind of obsessive about knowing the time. Is that part of me? I definitely feel I'm lacking something, and I'm not have it. Many of you feel you're lacking something without your computer or mobile phone these days because you get so dependent on that. But there are tricky questions about when does functional integration become some kind of real part of you. I'm not going to go more into detail about it, but I did have some speculations on that in the last chapter of my doctoral dissertation, which is online. If you go to my website or search for the diachronic self, I have a chapter trying to delve into that a little bit. I think it's going to be an interesting question of ethics and metaphysics in the future. Especially if, of course, you have various kinds of functional additions to the self, which may be semi-autonomous, like personal agents that go out and gather information, interact with people for you, maybe take over updating your Facebook page and answering people, because they can be a bloody nuisance sometimes in so many communications. You may have an agent that is integrated partly with you and goes off and takes care of those things. But what if they offend people? And are you responsible for what those agents have done? There'll be tricky issues. It may depend on what instructions you gave, whether that updates your memory afterwards, or is it, how autonomous is it? There aren't going to be very clear answers, I think. So in the future, we may see group people, either in hierarchies or in swarms. It could be, again, either temporary or permanent. It could be very hard to decide which is the individual. And these questions matter also, not just because we might be concerned, well, if I want to live longer, live indefinitely, what does that really require? What kind of changes can I undergo before ceasing to exist or becoming so different that it's not really me? So there might be a person walking around 1,000 years from now, but if they seem to have fractured or gone off in strange directions, according to my current perspective, do I regard that as survival or not? And it's also important because the issue of the self, I think, is closely related to the issue of rights. We tend to accord rights to conscious beings, conscious individuals. And if we're not sure whether the individual is conscious or how conscious or where the boundary is drawn around one individual versus another, we may have a hard time identifying the appropriate rights. So one thing we're going to need, I think, as we develop these increasingly complex types of cells, we'll need some kind of integration mechanisms. And there are various ways of doing that. One useful term here, I think, is people have often talked about homeostasis. That's something that really keeps you as an individual functioning. It's what keeps you rather than something falling apart into different components. Not Michael Rose, Stephen Rose, I think, has suggested the term homeodynamics instead, because we're not really staying the same. We're actually changing all the time, but we're doing it in a fairly coherent way. So we're kind of in homeostasis, but also in change. So he uses the term homeodynamics. So what kind of homeodynamics can we focus on if we expect a drastic change to the self? If we actually are concerned about remaining as some kind of individual, some kind of coherent being going forward, becoming more of an individual, becoming a more real self, how can we keep it together, so to speak? Well, right now, I think one area I'd especially be interested in seeing some progress on is right now we don't have much of an integration between our cognitive and our emotional faculties. These, again, are kind of areas of the brain primarily, and they don't always work together very well. We do understand something about the brain, especially in the area of fear mechanisms. Those have been most intensively studied. And we know that certain sights, historically, for instance, if a tiger was charging at you, then the sight of that would induce fear and thoughts like, I better run away. That would be pretty automatic. And you wouldn't have to decide to be afraid, it just happened, having seen that. And we can't really control those feelings. We see something that makes us sad or angry, and we can't just tell ourselves to calm down or feel happy. That kind of stupid expression, don't worry, be happy. It just doesn't work that way. You can say that a million times over, you're not going to just be happy suddenly. That's because apparently we don't have pathways. We've got pathways coming from the emotional centers of the brain to the cognitive center. So feelings can make us think certain things, partly why depressives get into exaggerated kinds of thinking, catastrophizing, and so on. But we don't have pathways going back the other way, or very minimal ones. So first of all, we're not usually even aware of what we're feeling. We've got this kind of vague sense of what we're feeling, but we don't really have access to that part of ourselves to even have a conversation with it and for it to cheer up. So one great thing I think about advanced neurotechnologies, biotechnology, nanomedicine, is that we might eventually be able to build new pathways going back into the emotional centers of the brain, giving us better self-awareness, which should help to improve our character and our ability to shape new cells. So that'd be one aspect of better integration. How much time do we have?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. Gosh, okay. So other areas which I've read about elsewhere, I would also make an emphasis on the idea of virtue. I'm a virtue ethics person rather than a utilitarian or a Kantian. I think virtue ethics has the advantage of other moral systems of promoting an idea of the integrated self. The virtue is a collection of qualities and characteristics that gives you some integrity of character, brings you together. Rather than calculating about the right thing to do in each situation, you become the kind of person who will do the right thing. That's a way of integrating it. Having a personal vision, I think, is another way of keeping yourself together through time, through changes. If you have goals, even though they will change and you'll update them, still it will tend to help you to resist external influences that shove you in directions you don't necessarily want to go. And as we have more and more technological options for changing ourselves in perhaps undesirable ways, having a personal vision of who you want to be, an ideal identity, if you like, I think is helpful. To me, one of the most frightening possibilities of the future, one of the ones I really worry about, is addiction to virtual realities, the very tempting virtual realities. This kind of self-reinforcing process where you get more and more involved in perhaps very narrow activity and maybe lose a lot of who you are. If the future virtual reality is indistinguishable from our regular reality, that becomes a bigger problem. So I think that's the single greatest threat to both students. I think, in my own view, maybe artificial intelligence running away, but I think self-destruction or self-narrowing, that constriction of the self is perhaps the biggest problem. Okay, well, since I'm down to minus 10 seconds, let me just finish off with back to TransVision. Should have a couple of quotes here. Foucault had a nice quote too, which is a nice way to finish off. He said, "Ask who I am, and do not expect me to remain the same. Leave it to the bureaucrats to see that our papers are in order." So really my final message is that we should welcome these kinds of changes and recognize that perhaps we're not really the people we think we are. It's questionable whether to say we don't exist with a Thomas Messenger and then it go too far. But clearly we're not that well unified. And part of the vision of transhumanism to me is to recognize the rich possibilities within ourselves, expanding while also becoming increasingly conscious and self-aware and able to sculpt ourselves and shape ourselves for the better. So the future is not just about a radical Star Trek transforming the outside world, but a radical resculpting of the individual. Thank you.
We have only time for one question. Let's see who is the first one. Anders, you are first. And only question.
This was a great talk, and I was reminded of another interesting talk I overheard a few weeks back also on computer science and philosophy, where Luciano Floridi was talking about what he called ecology, the theory of the self. And he brought up something interesting. What use is a self? And his answer was very, very explosive. He actually said, self, ultimate antidote to technologies in the universe. Because having a self means that you try to maintain your sense of self. But then he added something interesting. Of course, it is much bigger talk, but that's we need to develop these better self-engineering techniques and figure out new ways of doing ethics and what is that type of self.
Yes, that's one thing I had to skip was essentially neuroethics or identity ethics. I don't have a good term for it because identity I'm a little bit resistant to because it sounds so static. But yeah, ethics of what you could be, ethics of the extropic self or something. Really do need that. Do we have time for one more question? No? Okay. Okay, thanks very much.
So since things have been running late, we're going to stick to the agenda and take now half an hour. We will move to the next speaker, who is Martin Black, to immediately after the break. We will move one of the speakers scheduled for the second morning session to the afternoon session, taking also advantage of the fact that one of the scheduled speakers will not come. So I'll see you here in half an hour less at 11:30 sharp.
这多长的？